Hello, and welcome back to Fantasy Grounds RPG map and image creation. I'm Josh, and we are continuing on the series here. We've been working on creating this regional map, and I believe this is episode 5. Last episode, we created these wonderful mountains, and what we're going to be doing today is going through a similar process, but one from a more top-down perspective, something that would be a little bit more as if you were looking at Google Maps or some other topographical kind of image. This is very much a isometric style view, and our map is very two-dimensional flat and is from a top-down perspective. That's a pretty common combination of imagery that you see quite often in stylized maps and other types of artwork. So if you were wanting to deviate away from this and do a completely top-down kind of version of all of the different elements, that's what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to be going through a lot of the same kind of processes that we did on the other mountains, but we're going to be coming about it from that top-down perspective. So what I'm going to do, we got quite a lot of layers here that we're using for these mountains, and so I'm just going to select them all and put them in their own group. Put these mountains 1. And that's just going to be able to make it very easy for us to manage and manipulate and keep our layers over here nice and organized. It's always good. I struggle with organization, so the more that we can do it, absolutely the better. We still have our layer that we had flattened last time. We're going to use this over and over again. There's a lot of information in here that we can grab from, and so it's a really great source for us. And that way we don't really have to interfere with what's underneath. What we're going to do this time, instead of creating a selection first, what we're actually going to do is create a new layer. We're going to draw out, much like in this we have a ridge that the mountains follow. We're going to be drawing out our ridge first and figuring out how we want our mountains to be kind of laid out. Then we're going to do direct selections from the map, both in our shadows and on our highlights, and build it up from there in pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start up here, and I'm going to start drawing the ridge line much like that we created on this side. We want to keep in mind, shrink down my brush here a little bit, that we still want to have a lot of variations back and forth. These are still going to be our peaks where we get these abrupt changes. I'm going to bring it down and let's curve it in this way. Now looking at this, it has a lot of variations in here. Our highest peaks are probably going to be in this area. And I'll just drop this down a couple more times, and we're going to draw off some other lines going to the side here. Now we may or we may not use some of this. It's going to change as we go along here, but this is going to give us a general idea about the width and the size of these mountains. We might even get some offshoots that come down a separate kind of ridge, and we might get some other variations as we go. We're just doing this with our mouse, so we're not being overly critical of the shapes that we're making right now. This is going to be our guide. Now looking at this, it's hard to imagine that this is going to turn into a mountain range, but trust me, it certainly will. So what we are going to do now is we're going to switch over to our lasso tool. We want some of these variations, and we're going to we want to make sure that we're on this ground layer that we had set apart here. And we want to make sure that we grab out some sections, and we're going to turn them into shadows. And I always like to start with the shadows first and then build in some highlights. Gives me a good way that I can navigate through the creation process. And so thinking about the ridge line and how the light's going to be coming down, certain areas are going to be illuminated even though they're on this side. And certain areas are going to be in shadow even though they're on this side. But we're going to take it one step at a time and kind of go down through. I'm going to do all of my basic selections, and then we're going to go back through and make some adjustments later. I'm going to come in and just begin creating my selection. I'm going to follow this a little bit, but remember, this is just a guideline, and so it certainly does not need to have any set in stone kind of creations here. We hold down Shift and we can do more selections. Keeping in mind that these ridges that we are creating here are going to be highlighted and shaded. A fun little tip is that you don't need to hold down Shift the entire time you're adding a selection, just when you initially click the mouse. And then you can let go of the Shift button. I'm going to just add this in here. And so for the purposes of the tutorial, I'm not going to do the entire way here. I'll just concentrate on this top section. Now I'm only going to do selections on this side if I think that there's going to be a very drastic kind of change in the structure. So maybe in here, I'm going to come along, hold down Shift, and then once I start, like I said, I can stop. We're going to do a little bit more shadow than we think we need, because we're going to, as I said, we're going to deal with that a little bit later as well. Whoop. If you happen to do that, that's fine. Just hit Control Z and you'll be able to get your selection back. Make sure you remember to hold down Shift. And now we're going to hit Control J, and that's going to make us that copy. Much like we did before, we want to keep this relatively the same kind of values here. We can check how these make sure that we can still follow along this divide here quite well, but it doesn't have to be perfect yet. Next, what I'm going to do is I can go a little bit on the inside of this where we've created a new layer, because I want to incorporate some of this stuff as well. Because the opacity of this is solid, we have a lot more leeway when we run into that. And so I'm going to start a new selection with my ground layer, and we're doing our highlights now. Doing this in manageable chunks makes it much more easily handled. We want to make sure that our highlight meets right up with our shadow. We have our basic highlights and shadows all laid out. And what we're going to be doing now is let's just drop down the opacity of this guideline a little bit. We want to still be able to see all of the ridges, and we also want to be able to see what is underneath. And so that's probably the easiest way to do it. Let's actually make it about 40%. Now what we want to do is to have some of this interaction between our shadows and highlights and the ground itself to be a little bit more subtle. We don't need it to be so abrupt. So we're going to switch over to our eraser, and as we often use, the soft round brush. I'm going to just make sure that we have the correct layer selected. We're going to begin to much like we have in the past, ease this into our ground. The larger the brush you make it, the more feathered the edge is, and so that it will do more of a gradient. And we're going to go to our highlight side. We're going to do a lot the same. Now switching over to the shadowed layer, we can make a new layer, and much like we did with our other mountains, do a multiply. Let's switch to our soft round brush here, make it pretty good sized. Select our light highlight color here, and we're going to be very mindful of where the ridge is. So this is where we want to kind of focus. Follow all of these edges. Bring the opacity of that down a bit. And now we're going to do something similar with our highlights. And we're going to do a screen layer. This time we're going to select our shadow color. And again, we'll drop down that opacity. With our base down here, what we can do now is come in and begin to really add some detail in through here. I'm going to soften up some of these edges a little bit more. And I'm actually going to carve away some of these areas that the shadow might be more inclined to exist in. And any area where we think that we might want to add some of this highlight information, we can just go in and, much as we did before, grab our selection tool. And now I'm going to collapse down some of these layers. So we have but one highlight and one shadow layer. I'll go back to my selection tool here. And I'm going to pick out some of these variants down through here. I want to create some of these stress lines, these areas of maybe erosion or rock outcroppings, and I'm going to select some coming down from the top. I'm going to try to make sure that they make sense with the ridges. Making sure that we have the shadow layer selected. Hit Control J. And we're going to darken these up a little bit more. We'll make a new layer. We'll make it a multiply. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pull some stuff down from the edges here. Bring our opacity way down. So it's just very minor, maybe 20%. This will allow us to build up in here and make some very subtle changes. And it becomes very important that we really begin to bring out the ins and outs of the mountains. That there's a lot of variation in it. It's not a flat sort of creation. We can pull in some of this stuff into these little areas. And we're following our guidelines pretty well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these and I'm going to duplicate them and collapse them down. We can turn off these other ones. And if we drop down our opacity here a little bit, and blend it into our landscape a little. And what you can do is you can grab a selection of this, much like we did with the mountains. We can copy that, and if we paste it, we can do much like we did with our previous mountainous creations. And you can overlay these, change their size. You just want to make sure that you always keep them going in the same kind of direction. And we can now lower down our opacity a little bit if we want it to blend in a little bit more. Maybe 75. If we want to change the color in any way, or maybe even the saturation, we can just go into a layer such as that, and perhaps we wanted the top to be a little bit more gray. You can come in and And there we have it, a way to create top-down versions of our mountains for all of our map needs. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.